Welcome to the Northern Business Podcast. Each week we talk to people active in the economy and talk to them about the big issues driving growth in the north of England. We're sponsored by Virtue Motors, one of the UK's largest motor retailers. You can check out its website at virtuemotors.com. I'm Graham Robb, owner of Recognition PR. We help scores of businesses promote their products and services. Some are featured on this podcast. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. In the studio today with Ben Quaintrell, Managing Director at My Property Box, and down the line we have Delphine Strauss, who's the economics correspondent at the Financial Times. And later in the programme, my colleague Joss Havakin will be talking to Alice McCullagh, who's the Managing Director of Rosedene Nurseries. Well, first of all, welcome to my guests. Hello, Ben and Delphine. Nice to have a correspondent from, I suppose, Europe and one of the world's most prominent business publications. There you are at Financial Times headquarters in London. Now, I know you're an economics correspondent. What's your dipstick view of the sentiment of business at the moment in the economy?
I think there's a lot of gloom around on the backdrop in terms of growth. The data's been showing that GDP's not been growing at all for much of the year. The forecasts we had last week from the Office for Budget Responsibility were pretty gloomy downgrades from what they thought in March. And yet at the same time, you do see in some of the business surveys that, people are still looking to hire. There may be more confidence out there than some of this data shows. Yeah. I'll be interested to know what Ben's hearing and what you're hearing from contacts in the north.
Well, we'll definitely get to Ben to hear about that in just a moment. But hold your horses, Ben, because I know that, Delphine, one of your subjects that you look a lot into is the labour market. And, I've often said on this podcast, I've been in the labour market myself since 1980 and in the northeast of England, as it happens. And it's only in the last 18 months or so that the northeast of England has had unemployment rates that have been even near acceptable. In fact, today, the unemployment rate of the northeast is the same as the UK average, and that's almost unheard of in my lifetime. So there is a lot of change in not just how many people are employed, but where in the country they are.
Yes, we have seen this really strong upswing in the labour market ever since the COVID lockdowns came to an end, with all kinds of drivers behind it. Partly just, sheer enthusiasm for hiring, partly some of the worker shortages we saw after Brexit and as a result of, maybe some people having quit the labour market. And what's quite interesting at the moment is that although the labour market has been weakening over the last year, we've seen fewer vacancies advertised. We've seen unemployment creeping up a little bit in recent data. And we've seen, I think recruiters would tell us that they're now finding more people applying for jobs.
And we're flashing up some data from your paper, which shows the rate of employment, it's 76%. It's gone down a little bit, not much, but it's gone down a little bit since the peak of 76.5. And the actual numbers in work are well over 30 million, 33 million. So it does appear to be quite resilient, albeit, as you say, there is a little bit of hesitation around the edges now, isn't there?
So one of the issues at the moment is that the official data actually isn't being published. There are some problems with how reliable the numbers are.
Yeah.
But I think looking across a whole range of surveys, we can see things are weakening, but they're still an awful lot stronger than you'd expect when the economy is at a standstill and when interest rates have just gone up this sharply. It's not a normal downturn. And recruiters talk about a really, really mixed picture between different sectors. So in some white-collar areas, consultancy, accountancy, law firms and so on, you have seen some quite big layoffs. Construction is in a real slump because, of course, they're hardest hit by high interest rates at the moment, and a lot of house buildings on hold. But at the same time, you've got a care sector and a healthcare sector that's still struggling to hire, lots of hospitality businesses that can't hire. And, employers who are only just starting to be able to fill some of the gaps they've had over the last couple of years.
It's helpful to look at those sectors. One of the big debates in political life this week has been about the immigration data. I'm not talking about illegal immigration, I'm talking about legal migration for employment. 745,000 people net coming into this country over the last year. And that is primarily being driven by the labour market, isn't it?
It's quite a mix. So the biggest number there was actually students. Some of them encouraged by new visa rules that let them stay and work after they finished their course. But yes, the ONS did say that an increasing share of it was work-related. And that's been across all sectors in the last year or two, both the sort of high-skill, sort of white-collar areas that have always hired from overseas, and then also increasingly more and more driven by recruitment to the NHS, and more recently, recruitment to quite low-paid entry-level jobs in the care sector, which is, on the one hand, certainly helping to ease, a real crisis. And on the other hand, is a pretty bad sign that the sector just isn't equipped to hire in the UK at the moment.
Yes, it is a sector. We've had people on this programme from that sector. It's a sector that has a lot of problems because to a certain extent, the fees that it can charge are set by the government and the subsidies that are available from local authorities. And to a certain extent, the minimum wage sets the base rate, but it's also very responsible, and it's a job that is very difficult to get British people to work on. And then
it's a job that's generally paid at the minimum wage or not very far above the minimum wage. And it's an awful lot more difficult and more stressful than the other jobs you can do for that pay rate.
This podcast has had a lot of businesses contact it this week to talk about or asking to discuss the issue of the minimum wage with employers, because obviously the business podcast, very upset that the government chose the higher level of minimum wage that was available to it, because the low pay commission, as I understand it, you're more of an expert than I, the low pay commission could give a range that the government could set the minimum wage at, and they went for the higher end of that.
I think it's not so much that they had a range to choose from, it's that they had a target that's set by government to bring the minimum wage to 2/3 of the national average, the national median, by next year. And they were waiting for the data to come in to know what's been happening to typical earnings, what's the data showing, so that they can finalise the number. Actually, wages have grown much faster than we thought. Yeah. So the numbers ended up at the top of the range.
That is a very helpful explanation, because this 2/3 number was a target, and therefore is a government policy, not a mandate. But the Low Pay Commission also is asked to recommend things that will not affect employment, and it still landed on the higher number, didn't it? So presumably employers have just got to suck it up, but there are many employers having a good old whinge about it. Justifiably so in some cases.
There are certain sectors, generally the ones reliant on government funding, that are finding it a lot harder to meet that new minimum than others.
Yeah.
So I think what you see in a lot of low-paid sectors is that big employers have already moved ahead of the minimum. Yeah. So a lot of supermarkets and warehouse operators and so on have already felt the need to go well above the minimum to compete for workers. And then sectors where we really see struggling are, areas like childcare, where wage costs are the vast proportion of their overall costs. And, they're very influenced by the ratios they have to meet of staff to children and the requirement that's coming in to offer, more hours of free childcare with set government funding. And so they're really finding themselves squeezed. And to be honest, a lot of providers have only managed to make it work in the last few years because they increasingly use apprentices who are paid below the minimum wage.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk to a childcare provider later in this podcast about because the policy that's being implemented by these childcare providers to increase the amount of care available is also trying to tackle the worker shortage. It's part of the same jigsaw, isn't it?
It is. It's one of the measures that Jeremy Hunt announced back in March that was potentially going to make most difference to bringing parents into work.
Well, I'm glad you've raised a lot of those points on the programme today, because they are things that I'm hearing from our viewers and listeners. I want to just hold up for our listeners, I'm holding up a copy of the Financial Times from August this year, and this also talks about jobs and employment, but in the northeast of England. And the article, which is Civil Service Relocation Tests Hybrid Working, was written by Delphine when she visited Darlington for an article which I suppose could apply to quite a few northern towns where there have been government relocations. Tell us what inspired you to come to Darlington and to look at how things were working.
So it was a real pleasure coming to visit, especially in the middle of a fairly busy August. I came because I wanted to see, just sort of up close, how the Treasury's economic campus is working out there, how well it's working for the Treasury and how well it's working for the town, because it seems a really interesting experiment in civil service relocation that's not quite like what we've seen before. So we've had lots of examples of government departments moving this or that back office function away from London, but not very many attempts to move really core bits of policy making and senior staff away from Whitehall and create a sort of non-London career route for high flyers who want to get to the top of the civil service without being in the capital.
It's an interesting experiment, and I happen to live in Darlington, and perhaps once a month the flashing lights of a police convoy start because the Prime Minister actually works from Darlington once a month, and we had people like the CEO of Google visit. It's a bit extraordinary, a bit out of the ordinary, to say the least. What was your conclusion? How did you, you talked to a lot of people, I know. What conclusions did you draw?
I suppose that it was a really interesting, positive so far, but quite precarious experiment at the moment. So it's obviously given the town a big boost in terms of businesses wanting to locate there. Lots of law and accountancy firms potentially searching for commercial premises, quite a bit of pressure on space, boost property prices, and just sort of generally kind of, name recognition for Darlington. I think the officials who are working on the campus love it and think they can make a go of it, but it's quite dependent on the goodwill of whichever ministers are in the Treasury and in Number 10 at the time. So obviously at the moment, the Prime Minister's constituency is right next door, and the Chancellors, the former and current Chancellor have made a personal commitment to be there and to, work remotely with the officials who are there, enough to make it work. It's not guaranteed that would be the case under any government.
And it is true.
A lot of people I spoke to were quite nervous about what would happen next.
It's true of all very large organisations, whether it be government or a large corporation, that proximity, boss, is all, isn't it? There's an element of geography comes into play when it comes to your authority.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think it was also very much sort of, this can work if everybody wants to make it work. But one of the key things was that the Treasury wants it to be possible for any job at all to be done from any location, rather than trying to put, particular bits of policy that are seen as more relevant to the north in Darlington. And so that means you do get a proper career route. It doesn't matter where you're based, but it also means it's less obvious why policy is better off done in the north, if you see what I mean.
Yes. If you're working on an economic policy that's about exporting to Japan, why is it more rational to do it in the northeast than it is to do it in London? But the other question is true as well. Why not?
It's easy to prove. I suppose what you end up with saying, well, it's working fine, but there's no intrinsic reason why it should be here rather than somewhere else.
Well, Delphine, when you came up here, you interviewed my other guest, Ben Quaintrell. You had a good chat with Delphine, and you feature in this article in the Financial Times. Tell me the impact that has had.
Oh, it was fantastic. They've been to come to Darlington and talked about all the. I'm very optimistic. All the exciting things that's been happening in the town, and obviously the leveling up has sort of begun. But it had a great impact. I had people messaging me from all over, actually the country, that are from Darlington, friends I've grown up with at school that work in different cities, businesses in the area, and it just felt really, really positive and great, that the Financial Times have reported on it, and really positive sort of comeback, yeah.
So what were you saying to Delphine when she came up? And it was still in summer. Are the things that you said still true today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, Delphine at the start said, at the moment it is business to business, sector to sector, how people are feeling. It is completely that. And I can only comment really from the property side of things, but it is still fairly positive. In the summer, at the moment, we've experienced like huge numbers of people wanting rental properties, for example, and a massive shortage of property. Serviced accommodation, hodl let, short-term let has taken off in the area. And that's because of the number of people living in the town and working in the town. So yeah, it does feel positive. Obviously, we've slowed down a little bit now coming towards Christmas, which is natural. And from a developer's point of view, property people are still looking to develop. SME developers are still doing that now because demand is so high. But you might find that in a different area, that's not the case. Developers might be holding back, waiting for interest rates to come down, waiting for commercial finance figures to drop. But at the moment in Darlington and surrounding areas, it's because demand is so high, which is driving up rental prices. Figures still stack for developers to develop.
Now, Delphine, you came to a northern town rather than a northern city, and it has been the case that government departments have located to northern cities many times. The National Infrastructure Bank located to Leeds, and you've got many examples. There's a huge HMRC complex in Newcastle. There are many government departments located in Manchester. But the difference by bringing a significant location to a town, it's like a bigger pebble in a smaller pool, and it creates a bigger wave. Did you think that's true? And Ben, to what extent do you think it's true? I suppose Delphine first. What was the impression you got?
So I mean, that was one of the reasons I wanted to come, was because it applies not just to civil service relocation, but also to could any private sector business follow the same model now. I'm not sure if Darlington's typical. There was a lot of talk about how, in fact, you can recruit very much from the wider region because the transport links are so good. And that was one of the key things, to be able to recruit very wide range of people at speed.
It might be more difficult
in competition with local employers.
It might be more difficult in Cumbria or something like, or an area where maybe there are less fewer towns around it.
In practice, there were people commuting from Leeds. There were people commuting from around Durham. There were people coming in from a wider region. In terms of the impact on the surrounding area, I think the effects would be very visible in Darlington, but it's still just not a big enough thing to really filter through to the wider region.
All right. Ben, what do you think about the contrast between a location like a town like Darlington, which you could easily transfer to towns in West Yorkshire or County Durham or Cumbria, or a city, Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Manchester, Leeds and Newcastle were in competition for the Treasury?
I think Darlington was chosen because obviously with the levelling up policy of the North, but also because of its location. Obviously, we have the original railway that was built, which in 2.5 hours we can get to London. We're on the Edinburgh line. It's quite centrally located. We have the Freeport over at Teesside that's coming off. It's centrally in the north. We talk about the powerhouse of the north, but Darlington is right in the centre. So I think for companies wanting to relocate that that will work with the Treasury, or around the Treasury, the opportunity's there. But as Delphine says, because the transport links are good, then people don't have to live in the area. But it is still that powerhouse hub that people can travel to for work or live.
Before I let you go, Ben, I just want to ask you a question about your specialist subject, housing. The new local housing allowance rate is going to provide households with some extra support to help with higher rent payments. Is this going to filter through into yet higher rent payments? You're managing a lot of housing for private landlords.
No, it's obviously anything like that is good news, but I don't think it's quite enough of what's needed. Unfortunately, because demand is so high, that the rent levels now in Darlington, prime example, are just so high. Even with that increase, it still doesn't quite meet the current.
You're managing properties elsewhere as well. I know you're managing properties in Newcastle and Yorkshire. Is it the same situation elsewhere in the north of England?
Yeah, or, students, for example, we've managed a lot of properties in Jesmond, in Newcastle. Room rents, for example, a couple of years ago for £100, £120 a week, they're up to 150, 160, 170 now across Jesmond. So in every different area, whether it's serviced accommodation, HMOs, buy-to-let properties, commercial rent levels have moved. And that,
yeah. Well, Ben, thank you. Delphine, it's been lovely talking to you for the first time on our podcast. And the fact that you know quite a lot about the labour market, I'm going to definitely phone you up and say, come on our podcast again to talk about jobs and employment. It was fascinating hearing those points. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to join.
Now let's turn to something else. Time to turn to my colleague Joss Havakin, who's speaking to his guest this week about how new childcare support could help more people to find work.
Thanks, Graham. This week I'm joined by Alice McCullagh, who is the Managing Director of Rosedene Nurseries. Thank you very much for joining us, Alice.
Thanks for having me, Joss.
Not a problem. So I understand you've got around 10 nurseries in the northeastern Yorkshire, around 1,000 children who are using your facilities. But the government at the moment is very keen to get people into work, taking those economically inactive people and doing what they can to remove some barriers and to encourage them to become economically active. That is, in work or seeking work, or at the very least in training or education. Now, childcare pays quite a large part in that. Could you tell us a little bit about how your nurseries may be able to help those people?
Well, we, as you said, have got lots of nurseries across the region. We're just about to open a new nursery in the beautiful Stockton-on-Tees, and we provide amazing early years experiences for children from the age of 0 all the way through until they're ready for school. Mm-hmm. And Rosedene's quite unique in our ethos, where we do a lot of child-led outdoor learning, and we employ over 135 fantastic early years practitioners. And with the new government funding that you mentioned, which starts from April next year, this is allowing parents to be able to access support for childcare costs sooner. And it'll enable people to get back to work quicker after maternity. And of course, it'll enable children to access early years education much sooner in their childhood.
So you've mentioned some government support and funding. That was announced in the spring budget earlier this year. Can you give us a bit of an overview for that, please?
Absolutely. So there already exists a 3 and 4-year-old scheme where children can get 30 hours funded childcare per week. From April next year, children who are 2 years and above will be entitled to 15 hours childcare funding per week. And then from September, there will be 15 hours for children who are 9 months old and above. And the goal is for 2025 is that all children from 9 months will get 30 hours funded childcare every single week.
Okay, so that's brilliant for parents, but how's it going to help move some of those people who are economically inactive, aren't working or undergoing training at the moment? How's that going to help them move into the workplace?
Well, the goal is that the government want to provide the tools that give parents the opportunity to access the childcare, which is where we come in. I guess it's going to be down to the individual, it's going to be down to the local authorities and also small businesses in the area to be providing the jobs. And what we can do is just say, get yourself down the road to the nursery. We're creating the future society, especially in the north of England, and we're providing amazing experiences for those children every day.
Brilliant. Okay, so it's more of a case of making it easier for people to find that childcare and making it more cost effective, so it actually pays to be working as opposed to spending more money on childcare than what potentially they may be earning. I think that's got a lot of potential to move some of those people, because I mean, you know yourself that the workplace doesn't evolve around childcare. Childcare needs to evolve around the workplace, and the scheme certainly sounds like it might do it. Alice, I've just got to ask, you said you're opening a new nursery in the near future. Tell us a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
So we are hosting an open day next week, and this is a 72-place nursery in the heart of the Roseworth community. We'll be working really closely with the Stockton Family Hub, and we're situated right next to North Tees Hospital and the Nuffield Hospital, so we'll be a real service there for all working families in the area, and we'll be fully operational from the beginning of January. So we have a full team, and we have already 40 children who are ready to start in January. So it's a really, really exciting time for everyone at Rosedene.
So you said that's next week. This podcast is going out live on a Wednesday and put onto other platforms on a Friday. Do you know the date and the time of that open day, and how can people find out about it?
Yes, so we're offering a full day from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. and it will be on Tuesday, the 5th of December. And everybody's welcome. We will have lots of visitors, professionals, parents, and we're also letting our children meet Santa. So please just pop along if you're in the area. We'd love to see you and let you see all the facilities that we have to offer.
Brilliant. Well, best of luck with your open day, and I'm sure there's people listening who may just pop down to see the big man himself anyway. So thank you very much for your time, Alice.
Thank you.
Thanks. Out. Back to you, Graham.
Thank you, Joss and Alice. Now, if you'd like to join us as a guest on Northern Business Podcast, feel free to get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks today for my podcast producer, Harry Sinclair, and our technical operator, Robin Campbell. Join us next time on the Northern Business Podcast. Don't miss an episode. Like, rate, and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.